And so as we enter into chapter 9 of this letter or scroll that Moses has written to this people who he had led through the wilderness, people he knew and knew what they were like. So again, we see his passion for this people, knowing he was not going with them. So we see how he continues to long that they might get it right in their relationship with God. We see also again something of that thorny issue of the nature of God. But we also see what we might term some contradictions and exaggerations. So let's sort of launch in, and I've just split it into two sections really, verses 1 to 6 and then 7 to the end. But in verses 1 to 6, the first thing we see again, as we saw in chapter 8, is a warning against pride and complacency. When you do this, or when this happens, don't say, we must be so good, so righteous, so important that God has done this for us. Don't develop that attitude which says we're better than you as you look at the nations around you, but don't develop that attitude which says God does this because we are good. And this is still a temptation, consciously and subconsciously, within God's people today. God loves me, but not them. Or God has answered this prayer or that prayer because I'm good. And then conversely to that, God didn't answer this prayer or that prayer because I'm not. And it's how easy it is to weave that mindset in, that sort of pride and complacency. And Moses says, no. The only reason this will happen, that you will overcome obstacles that appear impossible from a human perspective, is because of God. He will do it, not because you are somehow better, but so that they might see him. Remember, they were called to be a kingdom of priests, a light to the Gentiles. We'll come back to that in a moment. But however, as we've already encountered, this leaves us with the question, is this the God we and people want to see? This sort of, annihilation, destroy, etc., etc. And as we think about that, we've thought about it already, but again, as we develop our thinking, one of the things that we see as a thread running through the Old Testament is this balance between justice and mercy. God is a God of justice and mercy. And often we see those two words used in the same sentence, justice and mercy. And in the New Testament, that thread continues, but we see it more as truth and love. God is a God of truth and love. God will show us or allow us to see ourselves as we are, truth. But he always presents to us the opportunity to receive forgiveness and to find our true self, mercy and love. And yet if we choose to reject this, if we choose to reject his offer, so we will suffer the consequences of our choice, justice. So we see that balance, if I can put it like that the nature and character of God was and still is a God of justice and mercy, truth and love. And then we come into verses 7 to the end, and we see, again, Moses reminds the people of their past. We have this long sort of account, recalling of his experience receiving the Ten Commandments. And Moses reminds them of their past. But he does this not to condemn them, but to teach them. I'm sure we're all familiar with the quote, which goes something along the lines of, someone who fails to learn from the past is destined to repeat it in the future. And Moses says, look back, please don't make those same mistakes. And we see this, the image of the golden calf, how easy it is for us today when God appears silent to go off and make our own God, to see, God somewhere else, or to try and find something else to fill that void. And Moses gives this long account of his sort of upping and downing of Mount Sinai at Horeb, his pleading for the people, God's anger against them. And it's here we see something of those sort of inconsistencies and exaggerations. 40 days without water, not a chance. We all know biologically that that is impossible. We might manage 40 days without food. We think about people who have been on hunger strike and so on, but 40 days without water, they reckon we might manage 5, maybe 7. And yet we see this stated twice. We see it echoed 4 times in verses 9 and 18. Moses repeats, I spent 40 days without food or water. And to us, this is strange language. But if we were to look back to the writings of the time, it was not uncommon. 40 days may not be, and almost certainly is not, a literal 40 days. We see echoes of this with Jesus in the wilderness. He spends 40 days in the wilderness without food, without water. Now, we might think, okay, Son of God, that might be possible. But we still see that figure of 40 days. In our own pattern, we still have 40 days in the cycle of the liturgy. But what we need to remember is that in sort of, Old Testament, Middle Eastern times, this term was used and expected to be understood in one of 2 ways. Either it was a considerable time, or it was seen as a solemn or a period of sort of solemn waiting, of religious preparation, as it were. So was it a literal 40 days? Probably not. Was there something, solemn, religious about it? Most definitely, yes. And so Moses says he waits. So we sort of try and work out, is there an inconsistency and exaggeration in there? From what Moses was writing when he wrote it, no. From what we read today and how we might understand it and interpret it, possibly yes. But what's important through this chapter, again, as we've seen already, is Moses reminds them he's given himself to them. He's given himself for them. He has stood in the gap, as it were, between God and his people. And what we see echoing through this and through previous chapters is Moses sees the potential in the people. They are called to be, as I said before, a kingdom of priests, a light to the Gentiles. Yet Moses also sees the potential for them to be tempted away towards complacency, pride, arrogance, and forgetfulness.